Picture this, Japan's mighty naval fleet terrorizing the Pacific in World War II. But here's the shocking truth. Most people don't know. Some of Japan's deadliest warships were actually built in Britain. Yes, the same Britain they would later fight against. Japan and Britain were once the closest of allies at sea. This friendship changed the course of naval history forever. Think about buying your first car from a dealership. You trust them completely. You learn everything about cars from them. That's exactly what happened between Japan and Britain in the early 1900s. Japan was the eager student. Britain was the master teacher. The story begins in 1902 with the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Japan needed a strong navy to compete with Russia and China. Britain needed an ally in Asia to protect their interests. It was a perfect match made in diplomatic heaven. Britain's shipyards were the best in the world back then. They had centuries of experience building warships. The British Royal Navy ruled the oceans everywhere. Japan saw this success and wanted to learn their secrets. So Japan did something smart. They didn't just buy British ships. They sent their brightest naval officers to Britain for training. These officers lived in British naval colleges for years. They studied British tactics, British engineering, and British naval traditions. The first major order came in 1903. Japan ordered several destroyers from British shipyards like Vickers and Yarrow. These weren't just any destroyers. They were cutting-edge warships with the latest technology. The British shared their most advanced designs with their new ally. Japanese workers also came to Britain to learn shipbuilding. They worked alongside British craftsmen in the shipyards. Every welding technique, every engineering secret, every design principle was carefully studied and memorized. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a complete knowledge transfer. Britain was essentially creating their future competitor. They were teaching Japan everything they knew about naval warfare. But here's the fascinating part. Both countries thought this partnership would last forever. Neither side imagined they would one day face each other as enemies. Can you imagine learning everything from your mentor, only to use those skills against them later? What would drive such a dramatic change in friendship? These British-built destroyers completely transformed Japan's naval strategy and capabilities. Japan went from having a weak navy to becoming a major sea power. Imagine getting a smartphone. Upgrade from an old flip phone. Suddenly you can do things you never dreamed possible. That's what these British destroyers did for Japan's navy. They were a quantum leap in technology and firepower. The destroyers Japan received were marvels of engineering. They had steam turbine engines that made them incredibly fast. Their guns could fire much further and more accurately than anything Japan had before. Most importantly, they carried torpedoes that could sink much larger ships. One of the most famous was the Harusami-class destroyers. These ships were built by the Yarrow shipyard in Scotland. They became the template for Japan's entire destroyer program. Japanese engineers studied every bolt, every pipe, every electrical wire on these ships. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, these British-designed destroyers played a crucial role. They helped Japan achieve something unthinkable: defeating a major European power at sea. The world was shocked when Japan's navy crushed the Russian Baltic Fleet, but the real revolution wasn't just about winning battles. Japan learned how to think about naval warfare differently. British naval doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and coordinated attacks. Japanese admirals absorbed these lessons completely. The destroyers also taught Japan about mass production. British shipyards could build multiple ships simultaneously using standardized parts. Japan took this industrial knowledge back home and applied it to its own shipbuilding industry. Soon, Japan was building its own destroyers based on British designs. They didn't just copy the ships exactly, they improved them, making modifications for Pacific Ocean conditions and Japanese tactical preferences. By 1920, Japan had one of the most modern destroyer fleets in the world. What started as a few British-built ships had grown into a massive naval force. The student had learned well from the teacher. How do you think Britain felt watching their former student become such a powerful naval rival? Britain didn't just sell ships to Japan. They transferred entire technologies and manufacturing processes that would shape naval warfare for decades. Think about learning to cook from a master chef. They don't just give you one meal, they teach you knife skills, seasoning techniques, and cooking methods you'll use forever. Britain gave Japan the recipe book for modern naval power. The technology transfer went far beyond just building destroyers. British engineers shared their metallurgy secrets. Japanese scientists learned how to make the special steel alloys needed for warship hulls. This knowledge would later help Japan build some of the strongest ships in the world. Propulsion technology was another crucial area. British steam turbines were revolutionary in the early 1900s. They were much more efficient and powerful than older steam engines. Japanese engineers spent months in British factories learning to build these complex machines. Fire control systems were equally important. British destroyers had sophisticated rangefinders and gun control mechanisms. These allowed them to hit targets accurately at long distances, even while both ships were moving at high speed. Japan studied these systems intensively. Communication equipment was also part of the package. British ships used the latest wireless telegraph systems to coordinate fleet movements. This technology gave them a huge advantage in battle. Japan quickly adopted and improved upon these communication methods. Perhaps most importantly, Britain shared their naval construction techniques. Japanese shipbuilders learned advanced welding methods, hull design principles, and quality control processes. They discovered how to build ships faster, stronger, and more efficiently. The British even shared their testing procedures. Japanese engineers learned how to evaluate ship performance, measure speed and maneuverability, and identify potential problems before they became serious. This scientific approach to shipbuilding was completely new to Japan. All this knowledge flowed both ways, though. Japanese engineers brought their own innovations to British attention. They developed new torpedo designs and improved damage control methods. The partnership truly benefited both sides, but this generous sharing of technology would eventually come back to haunt Britain. Japan used everything it learned to build a navy that could challenge British supremacy. What happens when you give someone all the tools they need to compete with you? The same destroyers and technology that symbolized friendship between Britain and Japan eventually became weapons of war against each other. Imagine teaching your neighbor to drive, only to have them race against you later. That's exactly what happened when Japan and Britain went from allies to bitter enemies in World War II. The transformation didn't happen overnight. During World War I, Japan and Britain fought as allies. Japanese destroyers, built with British technology, protected Allied shipping in the Mediterranean Sea. The partnership seemed stronger than ever, but things began to change in the 1920s and 1930s. Japan became more aggressive in Asia. They invaded Manchuria and later attacked China. Britain disapproved of these actions, but couldn't stop their former student. The final break came with Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan attacked the United States, Britain's closest ally. Suddenly, all those British-built destroyers were enemy ships. The hunters had become the hunted. Japanese destroyers, designed with British technology, now prowled the Pacific hunting British and American ships. They sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, two proud British warships. The irony was devastating for Britain. The Fubuki-class destroyers were perfect examples of this transformation. They were based entirely on British designs, but improved with Japanese modifications. These ships terrorized Allied forces throughout the Pacific War. They were faster, more heavily armed, and more maneuverable than most Allied destroyers. British naval officers found themselves fighting against their own technology. Every torpedo attack, every gun battle reminded them of what they had taught Japan decades earlier. The student had not only learned well, but had surpassed the teacher in many ways. The psychological impact was enormous. British admirals who had once welcomed Japanese officers as students now faced them as skilled enemies. Those same Japanese officers used British tactics and procedures against their former teachers. By 1943, Japan's destroyer force was one of the most feared in the world. They had combined British foundational knowledge with their own innovations and fighting spirit. Can you imagine the regret British leaders must have felt watching their former allies use British technology against them? Japan's British-built destroyers tell an incredible story of friendship, betrayal, and unintended consequences. A generous alliance created a deadly enemy. Technology transfer led to military competition. The teachers' lessons were used against them in the most devastating way possible. This hidden chapter of naval history shows how quickly international relationships can change and how sharing knowledge can have unexpected results. What did you think of this untold naval story? Like this video if you learned something new, and subscribe for more hidden history.